right, what's up, Mountain Springs? Yes. Wow, always great to be with you guys in this way. And if you are new here this weekend, I do want to add my welcome to you. And if you're joining us online, thanks for engaging with us in that way. Let's give a nice round of applause to those guys as well who are joining us online, who are new here this weekend. Always fun to be with you guys. My name is Ben Stewart, and among other things, I'm part of the teaching team here at Mountain Springs. But my day job is I actually get to help lead an internationally focused ministry called Uncharted International, and we work in hard places in the world that have very little access to the good news and hope of Jesus. And we have the privilege of identifying these brave men and women, national believers who love Jesus and who have a passion to introduce people in their countries to the hope and love of Jesus. And we get to just help accelerate what God's already doing in those places. I'll share a little bit more about that in the middle of this service, because today, you guys, we got some work to do, and I'm told you guys get a little rowdy if I go too long, and so we've got to buckle up, and we got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to be in Luke chapter 14, continuing this series of the dust of the rabbi. So we're going to be hanging out in Luke chapter 14, and if there was one sort of key phrase, or I guess you could say like sermon title, that encapsulates what's happening in Luke chapter 14, I would say it this way. I would say, the way of Jesus, unexpected and disruptive. The way of Jesus, the life that he calls you and me into, following him, is unexpected and it disrupts. So, let me pray before we dive in. That Holy Spirit, thank you, first of all, that you are with us. It's so good that we can come together as a community. The privilege it is to do that safely and openly, to worship you. We just ask, Spirit, that you would continue to speak, that you would give us ears to hear what it is that you have for us today, that you would give us minds to understand, that you would give us, more importantly, soft hearts to receive it, and a courageous spirit to respond to whatever it is that you invite us into today. In your name, amen. All right, so we're going to be hanging out in Luke chapter 14, and before we start reading through it, there's a couple of different things I want to explain to set up the context and the setting. Is that, first of all, there's sort of like two different episodes that happen in Luke chapter 14. The main episode happens around a table. It happens around a meal, and we'll come back to that, spend most of the time on that. And then the second episode at the very end of Luke chapter 14 happens on the road, Jesus journeying towards Jerusalem. The first episode, or the first scene that happens at a meal, it happens on a Sabbath. The first thing Luke wants us to know is that it's happening on a Sabbath. If you don't know what that term is, or you're unfamiliar with that concept, Sabbath was the day of rest for God's people, the nation of Israel. And so Jesus is invited over to a leader, a religious leader's home. They were called a Pharisees. Pharisees were this particular type of religious leader. And Pharisees especially were known for all of these extra laws that they would put in place, especially about Sabbath, to protect themselves from accidentally breaking the rule of not doing any work. A few weeks ago, actually, there was another teaching pastor named Pastor Steve Cuss who introduced this phrase, a boundary law. That Pharisees were known for placing these boundary laws, sort of like this extra protection layer law, to ensure that I, as a religious leader, as a Pharisee, I don't even come close to breaking the real law of resting on Sabbath. So what we're going to see in a second is Luke wants us to know that this scene is happening where Jesus is invited into the home of a religious leader, a Pharisee. There's others with him, and that it's Sabbath. But the second thing that we need to understand to really appreciate what's happening in Luke chapter 14 is the significance of the table, the significance of a meal during this day and age. Because if you and I'm starving right now, right? So I'm really excited about skirted heifer that's right around the corner for me. And I'm excited about that, that cheese that just coats the whole thing, and the French fries and the boiling soda, and it's awesome. And if you and I were to go there, we would hang out for 57 minutes and have some conversation. It'd be nice. And then we'd get a little awkward. I'd be like, well, see you later. And so meals for us just don't carry the same level of weight and significance that they did in this day and age. In fact, I want to read this quote to you by a New Testament scholar named Joel Green. Listen to some of the language that is used to describe the weightiness or the significance of what happens at a table, what happens around a meal. Meals were used to advertise, and reinforce social hierarchy. Let me pause there. In other words, Joel's saying, if you want to know, during this day and age, if you want to know exactly where you stand in your community, notice where you're sitting at the table. If you want to know how much value and worth you have in your culture and your context, look who's sitting next to you. He continues, where matters related to what one eats and with whom one eats it are significant, and where issues of honor and status break out into the open. So the table carried incredible significance for the culture of that day. Okay, so finally, with those things in mind, Jesus has been invited into the home of a Pharisee, a religious leader, who have all these extra boundary laws about making sure you don't work at all on Sabbath. This very paralyzing experience Jesus steps into, and what we're going to see in this first scene is an unexpected healing. An unexpected healing. So let's look finally at chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner at the home of a leader of the Pharisees. And the people were watching him closely. It was sort of like a test or maybe even a trap where they're like, all right, Jesus, you know all the boundary laws. Are you going to break them or not? There was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in religious law, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? Jesus is kind of poking them a little bit. When they refused to answer, Jesus touched the sick man and healed him and sent him away. Then he turned to them and said, which of you doesn't work on Sabbath? If your son or your cow falls into a pit, don't you rush over to get him out? With the implied answer of yes, but they could not answer. So here you have Jesus stepping into this highly charged cultural moment. He's been invited to share a meal with these religious leaders in a context that is bound with all of these laws, these extra layers of law, to not do anything. And all of a sudden, we have this unexpected character in the story. This man with this particular type of disease called dropsy. We might know it today as edema. And the basic cause or the basic issue with this disease is that your body would continually retain fluids of anything that you consumed. So it says that he was swollen. Your body would literally blow up because you just retained everything that you took in. Now, what's interesting and what makes this story, I kind of wanted to brush over this story, but what makes it so beautiful, what makes this moment actually with Jesus incredibly tender and very unexpected is knowing a little bit more about how this disease was viewed in this time, in this culture. There was actually a quote, there was a proverb, an ancient proverb about dropsy that said, nothing is as dry as a person with dropsy. It's a proverb that's filled with irony because what they believed about a person who is riddled with this physical disease of dropsy is that it actually represented something more about their person, their character, that they had this insatiable quench, this insatiable thirst, that they always were wanting more, that no matter how much they consumed, no matter how much fluids their body were filled with, it was like they were dry. Another way of saying it is, it represented a life that could never find fulfillment and satisfaction. And in that day and age, because of the lack of medical advancement, physicians could only address the symptoms. They could never heal the root cause. So maybe at best, the pain and the hurt and the suffering that this man was experiencing at best could be numbed, but never fully healed. And so both physically, but in terms of what he represented, was this idea of you will never find satisfaction. And I can't help but wonder if there's a way in which some of us can relate, obviously not physically to this, but to this idea of the pain that I'm feeling, the brokenness, the hurt that I'm walking through. At best, it feels like all I can do is numb it out. In this idea of continuously consuming, continuously taking in, but never feeling ultimately satisfied. Like we turn to the world and we say, what is it that you have to offer me to cover the pain, to numb me out, to find some level of relief, to find and experience some level of release? And so we keep taking in, we keep consuming, maybe even things that in and of themselves aren't bad, but at the end of the day, we are left feeling dry and empty. And then Jesus breaks into the scene. And what else is fascinating about this moment is that the man doesn't even ask to be healed. Jesus just does it. And when Jesus heals, he's not just dealing with the symptoms, because his healing goes deeper. It's as if in this moment, Jesus is saying to his audience, to those Pharisaical leaders around him, he's like, look, I don't care about your religious laws. I don't care about your boundary laws. I don't care about what religious system I'm supposed to play by in this moment. In this moment, in this unexpected moment, to an unexpected person, in an unexpected way, I am going to bring healing and freedom and release and ultimate satisfaction to this person, because that is what Jesus does. So the question that I have for us, is there a deeper way? Is there a deeper way we need to experience the healing of Jesus? At levels that maybe we didn't even think possible. In ways and at moments that are unexpected. So we see right out of the gate at this meal scene, this table scene, that Jesus is doing unexpected things, but then things get a little bit crazier. Verse 7, here we go. We have an unexpected healing. In verse 7 now, when Jesus noticed that all who had come to the dinner were trying to sit in the seat of honor. Underline that, circle it, especially the word honor. He noticed that they had all come, were trying to sit in the seat of honor near the head of the table. He gave them this advice. When you're invited to a wedding feast, don't sit at the seat of honor, because what if somebody who's more distinguished than you is also invited? And there's this really awkward moment where the host is going to come to you and you say, hey, you have to give this person your seat. Then you're going to be embarrassed, and you'll have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. Wah, wah. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table. Then when your host sees you, he will come and say, friend, we have a better place for you. Then you will be honored in front of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Verse 12, then he turned to his host. When you put on a luncheon or a banquet, don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. Okay, we have to, again, understand the cultural significance of what's happening here, because as Jesus is continuing to engage with this meal, with these Pharisaical leaders, we begin to catch a glimpse of a very specific cultural moment, a very normative cultural practice that Jesus is going to use in order to introduce this groundbreaking, I would even say scandalous kingdom concept. Okay, Jesus, you have to use your imagination here, all right, guys? You're in this scene. Jesus is watching. Everybody's sort of starting to vie around and just jostle and move elbows and, where can I get into this seat, this place of honor? Now, in this day and age, their society, their culture, was based on what we would call an honor-shame culture, okay? That's very different from our culture. Here in America today, and a lot of other Western cultures and countries have what's called an innocent guilt society. In other words, the way that we view things, the way that we deem what is right and wrong, even our whole judicial system is based off of whether you're innocent or guilty, right? What do we even say in our judicial system? We say you are innocent until proven guilty, right? It is embedded in our society and in our culture. But in this culture, it wasn't about innocent versus guilty. It was about honor versus shame. In other words, the way you lived life was all about how do I get as much honor as possible? How do I increase my value? How do I get more self-worth? Or how do I cover my shame? How do I hide the broken parts of my life that I don't want others to see? Now, what's interesting is actually today, in this day and age, there's a lot of other cultures that are also honor-shame cultures. A lot of cultures in Asia, a lot of cultures in Central Asia, the Middle East, they're actually honor-shame cultures, not innocent guilty. And I want to share a story with you guys that it did for me significantly help this passage come alive. It's a story that I've never shared publicly before, and I hope in sharing it you hear my heart in it and what I'm not trying to say, because this is the story. Back in 2021, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. Now, Uncharted works in places like Afghanistan, including Afghanistan. And we have what we call field partners, men and women in the country who are doing brave things to share the love of Jesus. So in 2023, just a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to get into Afghanistan and to check on our field partners and see how things were going. So I show up in Afghanistan, I'm hanging out with our field partners for a couple of days, and then our lead guy comes to me and says, we've got some visitors, some honored guests coming to have lunch with us today. I was like, oh, okay. Turns out it was members of the Taliban government who were coming to have lunch with me that day. So I had lunch with the Taliban, which is a phrase I never thought I would say in my life. And in fact, I think there's a picture of the little ceremony we had before lunch, cutting cake with members of the Taliban. I'm the white guy in the middle, in case you didn't know. I can honestly say the last time I had held somebody's hand cutting a cake was on my wedding day. So in that moment, I really wasn't sure where we were going next. It's probably one or two ways, and I didn't think I'd like either. But after this moment, we moved into the dining room to have lunch together. And I'm sharing this with you. Here's what I don't want you to hear. I'll say it this way. Know this. The system, the structure, the objective of the Taliban worldview is evil. It is broken, and it is riddled with injustice. Full stop. And yet, two passages of Scripture came fully alive in my heart as I was sitting at a table with members of the Taliban. The first was Psalm 23. You, God, prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. And in that moment, the Spirit broke my heart and into my heart, and He gave me new eyes to see. That on paper, I was sitting across from people who, on paper, are my enemy and I am theirs. I am a white, male, evangelical American that represents everything they are against, and they are radicalized Islam. We are enemies. But in that moment, the Spirit gave me new eyes to see that these are God's creation. And that even though there's brokenness and sin, that he loves them. And it breaks his heart that he's not in relationship with them. And in that moment, he invited me to pray for them, quietly, silently. But to see them with new eyes. But do you know the second passage that came to life for me was this one. This moment that Jesus is watching, this table moment, because what happened to me is as I'm standing there, kind of like this dumb American just waiting to see what happens, is all of a sudden these hands get put on my shoulder and I start literally getting moved around, like kind of brought up here and then kind of back down here and moved back a little bit. And I'm looking around and like it's just super chaotic scene and everybody's moving and like chairs are shuffling and people are dashing in and out of each other. And then all of a sudden I'm sitting and it goes quiet. And I look around and I realize I just lived Luke chapter 14. And I look at the head of the table is the lead member of the Taliban for that group. And at his right is number 2. And on his left is me. And when I looked down the rest of the long table, I could tell by where people were sitting the level of honor that they held, the level of importance, of dignity, and of value that they had been given in that moment. And Luke 14 came alive. And I realized how significant and how disruptive the words of Jesus are in this passage. Let me read to you another quote by Joel Green describing this. Jesus is doing far more than offering sage counsel for his table companions. Rather, he is toppling the familiar world of the ancient Mediterranean, overturning its socially constructed reality and replacing it with what must have been regarded as a scandalous alternative. And I think those words are important to hear because at first blush, when you're reading through this part of the story, it can sound like Jesus is trying to kind of be sneaky, right? Like, okay, here's actually what you got to do. If you really want the honor, then you got to start at the bottom of the table and just really hope that somebody comes and moves you to the top. That's not what Jesus is doing. He's actually completely blowing up the system. And he's introducing a radical new alternative to what it means to find honor and where to find honor. Look at what Jesus says in verse 12, or starting in verse 11. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he turned to the host and he said, when you put on a luncheon or a banquet, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors, for they will invite you back. That will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Then, at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you. It's like what Jesus is saying in this moment is, okay, look, I get it. I get the system of the world. I get the structure of your culture. That what your world is telling you, what your culture is saying to you, is that if you want to find value, if you want to know how much you're worth, if you want to know how much honor and dignity you have, you've got to play this certain game. And friends, we may not use a table or a meal, but in our culture, we've got our systems, right? A lot of them. I mean, even social media. Like how many, especially in the now generation, are finding their value or lack thereof, their sense of identity, their sense of worth, their sense of am I accepted by how many followers do I have? Only 716? Oh no. I got only 89 likes on that post. What's wrong with me? Or like when our grades slip from our 4.0, that what deteriorates is not just our GPA, but our sense of self-value. Or like the system of our jobs. That, hey, what really speaks honor and value and worth is how high up the ladder have you climbed? What's your title? How much money are you making? Or family? My sense of value is as long as my kids are behaving okay and we look really great on the outside, especially on a Sunday morning, then I just feel like I've done my job and I have honor and dignity. So we have our systems that we go to in our world to sort of assess and announce, this is how much honor I have, or to cover our shame. To use things in our world to hide from the world what's really happening. Friends, what Jesus is saying at this table moment, he's not just giving you some pithy advice, like 3 points on how to get more honor in life. He's completely blowing it up. And he's saying, you want to know where your honor comes from? Do you want to know where your value comes from? Your self-worth? It comes from my Father, the one who created you, the one who sees you for who you really are and loves you deeply and desires passionately to be in relationship with you. So I get it. I get the games of the world. I get the proverbial chair shuffling and elbowing your way to get closer to the head of the table. But stop playing that game. And look to my Father, because he is the one who ultimately bestows honor, who gives you dignity, and is the source of your identity. So Jesus continues on with this meal scene, and he continues to teach. In the following verses, he actually introduces a concept that we're actually going to see articulated more in the final episode of this chapter. So we come finally to verse 25. Jesus has left the meal scene. He's left the dining room. He's left the home, and he's back on the trail. He's back on the road to Jerusalem. And he looks around, verse 25, a large crowd was following Jesus. And he turned and said to them, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else. Your father, your mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Okay, so again, use your imagination here. Pretend like you're watching this scene play out. Jesus leaves the house. He's on the road back to Jerusalem. He starts trekking down, and all of a sudden he turns around and realizes, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people behind me. And he realizes, based on the language that Luke is using, that these aren't just like casual followers. These are people who actually want to be his disciples. So Jesus turns, and he has a bit of a mic drop moment with them. He's like, all right, guys, come here. You want to be my disciples, huh? Like this whole theme of like, you want the dust of the rabbi on you. That's cute. That's cute. Cool. Let me tell you what it really means to be my disciple first. And then tell me if you still want to. And so there's two things that Jesus says. He says, first of all, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else. Your father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, even your own life. Okay, what Jesus is not saying, teenagers, this is not your new life verse, okay? This is not Jesus saying, giving you permission to hate your parents in that way. All right. But Jesus is using comparative language. It even says that in the text. Jesus is using comparative language. In other words, what he's saying is that your love, if you want to be my disciple, your love for me should make the love that you have for your spouse, the love that you have for your children, the love that you have for your parents, the love that you have for your siblings, the love that you have for your best friend, the love that you have for your job, for your career, for your reputation, all of those loves should pale in comparison to the love that you have for me. They should be like almost nothing. Like the world might even be like, does that guy even like his wife compared to how much he loves Jesus? Jesus is using comparative. He's saying, look, your allegiance to me should make your allegiance to everything else, your family, your career path, your nation, your political viewpoint, your allegiance to those things should pale in comparison to your allegiance to me. So when Jesus is saying, I love that you want to follow me. I love that you want my dust all over you. But hang on. First, it means your love for me, your allegiance to me, makes all other loves and allegiance pale in comparison. The second thing he says, though, is he says, if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Remember, Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem where he what? Goes to the cross. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, if you really want to be my disciple, if you really want my dust over you, then you must identify with and embrace the sufferings and the abandonment that I experience. We must be willing to say, as followers of Jesus, that I am not only willing to suffer, but I am willing to let go. And I wonder if for some of us, the second part of that is the hardest part. To let go. To surrender everything in order to follow. The dreams, the ambitions, the goals, the way we want to be viewed, the hopes, the expectations. To have our garden moment like Jesus did just a few days later where he was with the Father and he said, look, I would love it if you would take this cup of suffering from me, but not my will, but yours. So friends, the way of following Jesus entails taking up our cross and being willing to say, I will suffer and experience abandonment in the name of Jesus. He closes the chapter with two brief examples. The first is in verses 28 through 30. He uses the parable, the analogy of a construction site. And he's like, okay, there's a guy who wanted to build a building, and he starts laying the foundation, and then he realized this is going to cost more than I realized. And so he says, I'm out. And people make fun of him. The second analogy that he uses is in verses 31 through 33. It's a military conquest. It's of a king who sees the enemy approaching and sends out his military to respond and then realizes too late that the enemy is bigger and more than he thought. And so the king has to surrender and says, this was harder than I thought, so I'm throwing in the towel. And again, I can't help but wonder, have at any point in our followership of Jesus, have we felt those things? Ooh, this is costing me more than I thought. Like I love the songs that sing about, your peace and your joy and heaven and all that really fun stuff. But like, I didn't think you were going to ask me to give that up. I didn't think I would have to surrender that part of my life. I didn't think, this is too hard. I think I'm out. I hope it can be said of me that the dust of the rabbi covers me. I hope it can be said of you that the dust of the rabbi covers you. I have an Afghan believer who's a friend named Ali. He told me when his actual brother came to him in secret, wanting to be a believer, Ali said to him, I love it, that's awesome. Come back to me in 6 months and see if you still want to be a believer. He's like, why? Because it's going to cost you everything. Friends, do we realize that what it means to have the dust of the rabbi on us is that our primary love and allegiance, far more than anything or anyone else, is Jesus? and that we are called to take up our cross. As Brennan Manning says to end, that littered along the Calvary road will lie the skeletons of our egos, the corpses of our fantasies of control, and the shards of our self-righteousness, self-indulgent spirituality, and unfreedom. Because the cross, it's both the symbol of our salvation, but it's also the pattern of our life. So may the cross be the pattern of your life. God, we thank you for your word, how it speaks to us, yes, with conviction, with clarity, but also with tenderness, with invitation to more. For those that need to hear the word of healing, of unexpected healing, how your healing goes deeper. God, may that be the word that they leave with this weekend. If it's a word about honor and dignity and value and worth, that those are ultimately and only found in you, Jesus, would you free them? Free them from playing the games of the system of this world. But for others, God, maybe this is like a wake-up moment to shake us out of status quo in our faith, to invite us to really understand the cost of discipleship, to re-engage in what it means to really follow you, and to actually have your dust all over us. Amen.